So welcome to a special vlog that I'm recording, and I had the pleasure of presenting this talk in Cork, Dublin and Belfast recently. None of those were filmed, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and film it myself for posterity and all that. So essentially what I try and do with this talk is introduce people to their own social movement, which sounds a little bit weird, but you'll kind of get the gist as I move along, I'm sure. And so I normally tell people that I've been vegan since 1979. I've been involved in lots of different campaigns involving Sea Shepherd in the Orkneys. I'll put a link to a video that I did about that below, and various kind of single issue campaigns along the way. That I was once a press officer for the Animal Liberation Front, or more technically the Animal Liberation Front Supporters Group, and for which I spent 4 years in prison. And that I turned to academia, and my MA was about the British animal movement, and my PhD was about the support pillars of cultural speciesism, which are philosophy, theology and everyday social practice. I start with a definition of social movement, which really is an organised effort by a group of people really to bring about some change or resist some change. So here we get the relationship between the movement and counter movement, and the classic example I give of that is the pro-choice, pro-life movement, counter movement. Academics have a fancy word for that relationship between a movement and counter movement. They call it the movement and counter movement dialectic, but we don't need to go into all that. So what I tend to do is show a bunch of slides, and I pick out some relevant parts of it as I've done here. So if you want to see the entire slideshow, I will happily email it to you, and I'll put the address for you to send below as well if you do want to see it. And essentially here you've got one of the co-founders of the vegan social movement in Britain, Donald Watson, saying that it's important for people to know the origins or the history of the movement they've joined, and I think I agree with that sentiment. There is a tendency at the moment for people to join the vegan movement and then almost make up what it means and decide for themselves the value of the movement they've joined. I kind of tend to think that that's not really on. You don't join a social movement in that context. So this is Watson really saying that know the origins of what you've joined, and to do so means that you can then remain faithful to its general principles. And I think that's a very good advice for all social movements, and the vegan movement is no Rouge. No, just just interrupted there by a cat demanding to be fed. So you might be able to hear a chomping away in the background. So this is the vegan social movement then. This is the movement that I introduced people to, and it's founded in 1944. I also mentioned that the time of founding had a profound impact on the people who founded our movement. We're talking about the last years of the Second World War, and that really did mean something to them. Essentially, part of what they were all about was trying to come to terms with the fact that we just had, in very short order, two global conflicts, or at least two conflicts involving many nations. And they thought that something had gone wrong, really, with humanity in general, in order for this kind of savagery to have come about. They witnessed the rise of the Third Reich, not to be dismissed as as nothing in a way. And so they saw themselves as part of the peace movement. Donald Watson himself was famously a conscientious objector, and they saw themselves as standing for justice. and non-violence. And I tend to kind of summarize the vegan values as those that incorporate the notion of justice for all, which may or may not prove to be controversial, but there we go. And a central part of all of this, and this is a bit that they took very seriously and is a persistent theme in their writing, is the idea that veganism is part of the moral evolution of humanity. They really did think that the solution to the problem with humanity in general was wrapped up in the idea of veganism, that a vegan mindset would change the way that we think. And that, again, possibly controversially, would mean that in a vegan world, in theory at least, there should be no domestic violence or rape or oppression of any type, really. You know, it's a very kind of fundamental and revolutionary idea. And it's that idea that I want to preserve and certainly not get lost in claims, for example, that veganism is a diet, which it isn't, or that veganism is only about other animals, which is a popular claim amongst the activists at the moment, and that is also false. Veganism was never just about that. We'll come on to that a little bit. Now, the history of social movements tends to be, at least many, tend to be white and female, and that is also the case in terms of the vegan social movement. However, we have many female voices in the vegan movement. The problem with that, I guess, is that not many are known. We have Elsie Shrigley here, also known as Sally Shrigley, and Dorothy Watson. That's their wedding day, Don and Dorothy Watson. You can work out which is which, I'm sure. And it's often said that Donald Watson coined the word vegan and famously took the first 3 letters of the word vegetarian and the last 2 and came up with vegan. There is some evidence that Shrigley may have done that, or at least been part of it, and the same goes for Dot. May have done it on her own, or may have done it with Don or the others. As usual with quite a few kind of histories, it's the male voices and the men that become highlighted, and so that needs to be said. Kathleen Janaway here, an important part of the early years of the vegan social movement, and in fact she moved on in the 1970s to create Movement for Compassionate Living, which is really kind of interesting, a group which still exists. You can Google that, Movement for Compassionate Living. And then Eva Batt, I'll show you a quote from Eva Batt in a few minutes, and she's also fairly famous with the movement for creating one of the first, if not the first, vegan recipe book. In fact, she did 2, What's Cooking and then What Else is Cooking. So the movement's history may be quite male in the way that a lot of people describe it, but there's a lot of women involved, as there often is. Of course, the movement's history is very white. There's nothing I can do about that. The founders of the vegan social movement in Europe or in Britain or in England, whatever you want to call it, were all white. Nothing I can do about that. Now, this is a claim from the 1990s, and it gives us a summary of what the vegan social movement is all about. And this is claiming that we should have a consistent approach to these things: human rights, animal rights, ecology. At the time, that we understand that now as environmentalism, but ecology was the word used then, and world food problems, which we now would call food security issues. You know, that issue about the fact that there is enough food right now to feed everyone, and yet, you know, many people die of starvation-related issues on a daily basis, and yet the farmed animals are always fed. You know, we as a world, if you like, choose to provide feed over food. It's a really interesting one in the sense that vegans often hear the claim that we care more about other animals than humans, and yet ironically the world itself does that, in the sense that makes sure that farmed animals are fed while humans starve on a daily basis. So this is Eva Barth herself then, from 1964, and it's a pamphlet published by the Vegan Society called Why Veganism, and it contains this striking and really brilliant quote: "Veganism is one thing and one thing only, a way of living which avoids exploitation, whether it be of our fellow men," and of course the language of the time was sexist, so men as in humanity, "our fellow men, the animal population, or the soil upon which we rely to exist." And so that's an interesting one, isn't it? The idea that we can exploit the soil. This theme came back into the movement in the 1980s in the work of John Robbins and Diet for a New America, a fairly famous book. And it is true that in terms of sustainable living, we are doing a lot of damage to the soil, and there is claims that we might actually run out of fertile, productive soil fairly soon. It's something that the early vegans were very much worried about, and they took into account in terms of their grand vision of what veganism is all about. Now, this is perhaps one of Donald Watson's more controversial claims, and basically he's saying here that veganism is the greatest cause on earth, and he talks about other movements as lesser movements. Now, I think that what he was getting at here is that the ideas behind veganism, about justice for all and peace, non-violence, could be an overarching principle for everything. And although this is kind of controversial, because I'm not sure he was saying that it could incorporate the feminist movement or the anti-Nazi movement, that kind of thing precisely. He was basically saying that here veganism is a big idea, and we are addressing all problems that humanity faces at once through veganism. And he used the metaphor of other movements are kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, while veganism, if you like, so to speak, were getting on with the main core business of bringing about a world in which everyone would benefit. And that becomes a consistent, persistent theme for the vegan pioneers, that as we liberate other animals, then we liberate ourselves. It's a persistent theme, as we'll see. So, this is Donald Watson talking in 1947, so fairly early on, and it's often said that Watson was really just somebody who talked about health and food. Not true. He actually talked about veganism in terms of a revolution, and he said that veganism would represent the greatest peaceful revolution ever known. And again, this theme returns in the interest of humanity and other animals alike. This is a persistent theme in early vegan writing. And so when we do get these claims that veganism is nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with humans, this is just wrong. Plainly a wrong statement to make. Sometimes I feel as though I wonder whether some people have joined the wrong movement. But there is actually a warning embedded in social movement theory about this, which is that when you get a movement taking off, and we could all argue that veganism has become very popular and powerful as a movement at the moment, what can happen, and this is a great worry for social movements, is that you get a big influx of people who don't share the same values of the people who founded the movement. This even happens in business, where you've got cases where someone is ejected from a business which they themselves started, and so there is a kind of problem, if you like, of people who subsequently join a movement rejecting the core values of the movement that they have joined. In a way, that sounds a bit weird, because you would have thought you wouldn't have joined the movement in the first place, you know, if you're doing that. But that tends to be the way. And of course, ideas do evolve. There is no kind of issue there. My issue with all this is that we should at least be aware of the values of the founders of our movement, you know, and then take it from there. You know, we shouldn't just pretend that we know what veganism is and start from that kind of level where we don't even know the grand kind of expansive view of veganism that existed within the writing of the founders. That's the bit that worries me, and that's the bit that I think is very unfair. Sometimes I have conversations with people about the founders of the movement, and I sometimes get comments like "F the founders." Well, that's not acceptable to me, you know, in the same way as, you know, you wouldn't expect people to join the Marxist movement and go "F Marx, I'll make up what Marxism means myself." You know, that's not the way it works. It's kind of like not fair to do that to a social movement. Okay, this is Jack Sanderson, and he's the editor of The Vegan. This is 1965, and again, a grand scheme of things: erase from the face of the earth all the wrong exploitation of the earth's collective life. Another great quote, and again that theme is reproduced, talking about the creatures, the plants, and humanity, all interlinked. This idea, to borrow David Nybert's phrase, oppression and liberation is entangled. David Nybert's entanglements thesis, which everyone should be aware of. And this is very much in the mind of the vegan pioneers, that our oppression and our liberation are intertwined and entangled with that of others, particularly ecologically, in terms of threat to the earth, which is a big major issue right now, of course, but also in terms of human oppression and liberation, and other animal oppression and liberation. These things were an entangled view of the pioneers repeatedly. Okay, now this is Leslie Cross. I tend to pick out this bit before we go any further, which is, he says here in 1954 that we are the pioneers, and I have a blog entry called Hello Donald, which basically argues that we still are in the pioneer stage of the vegan movement. And I think that we have to recognize that historically veganism as a social movement is new or recent. You know, we're talking about a movement that has not existed for 100 years. We're talking about a movement that was started as a social movement in the 1940s and really kind of developed from there, you know. And so I think that we are still the pioneers, and the kind of vegans rather longer in the tooth like myself. I think our job is to lay down a solid foundation for the vegans that come, you know, and I think that is kind of our job as still pioneers of the movement. And so this raises something that Cross talked about a lot, and I characterize this using the concept of focus and scope. And so when people say that other animals is the kind of thing that veganism is about, I think it's true to say that that's the focus of what veganism is about, but it's not the scope and never has been. And so Cross tends to talk about this in the sense that he talks about the focus and what veganism would mean to other animals, and then he says this change towards veganism incorporates things that are not so obvious. And what that basically means is that the things that are not so obvious perhaps is the benefit that humans would gain from veganism. Yeah, and so the benefits to humanity themselves, and crucially he talks about how they would benefit, we would benefit as a species even, in terms of health and then physical and mental well-being. basically means that if we are in a society in which justice is the key principle, he thinks that, and the pioneers thought that, this would return us to what they saw as a fundamental reality of what humanity is all about, which in a sense they argue has been corrupted, and then led to a massive war. And so we would vastly improve our mental and physical health through veganism. Again, a big claim. This is 1954 and Leslie Cross again. And this is where he talks in terms, he used rights language here, that few regarded the animals as being either worthy or entitled to the right to be free, and probably fewer still realised the impressive effect which the granting of such a right would have on the freedom of humanity itself. So again, those themes repeated, that we would benefit as well as by recognising that other animals have rights. I think it's worth probably pointing out here, because some people talk in terms of granting rights to other animals. This is like a misreading of what animal rights is about. Animal rights is about moral rights rather than legal rights. Legal rights may be granted, but animal rights is a question of arguing rationally that other animals have rights, and that the problem is that those rights are disrespected, not respected. Not that they don't have them and they need to have them given to them as gifts. That's a misreading of what animal rights is all about. I think that's very important. It's almost like suggesting that women were not rights bearers until men kindly gave them the right to this, that, or the other. That's not the way it's seen. It's seen that they had those rights. It's just that those rights were not respected. That's the way that we should see animal rights. That's 1954. This is Leslie Cross again, from The Vegan in 1951 this time, and this is where the focus and scope part really comes out. This first paragraph is all about the focus, and then the second paragraph is all about the scope of veganism. And so he talks about the second broad aspect of the vegan aim. So he talks here about how we would begin as vegans to interact with other animals in a different way, obviously not eating them, etc., etc. But then he says that the second broad aspect of veganism would be about its effect on humans and humanity, and essentially talks about human evolution. So veganism was seen as something that would change human moral evolution for the better, of course. Yeah. So a very important theme. And then he says, until the present relationship between humanity and his fellow creatures is replaced by one of companionship on a relatively equal footing, the pursuit of happiness by humanity is foredoomed to a tragic and painful frustration. I pick out in italics relatively equal footing, because I think that again speaks to animal rights philosophy. And when I say animal rights philosophy, I mean rights-based animal rights, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the reason that we need to use that phrase is because the kind of leading philosophical lights of the movement are not rights-based. We have a strange position in the animal rights movement where we have a philosophical mess. The lead author, which most people still know about, or decreasingly so, is Peter Singer, who rejects rights as the foundation of a social movement. It's the equivalent of the kind of leading scholar of the human rights movement not actually believing in rights. That's the situation we have in animal rights, so it's a philosophical mess. When we look towards rights-based animal rights, then I point people towards Tom Reagan, who really kind of founded, if you like, the abolitionist approach to animal rights, and he wrote the groundbreaking book in 1983, The Case for Animal Rights. Joan Donaire, who unfortunately is a kind of forgotten voice in the movement, she wrote two really good books, Animal Equality and Speciesism, and then, although controversial in the movement at the moment, Gary Francione is also a rights-based theorist. And going back to movement and counter-movement, it should be noted, and this is a good way of understanding Gary Francione, is that he runs a counter-movement, that he's not part of our movement. In fact, he would rather like to destroy our movement and replace it with what he calls his own version of the abolitionist approach. And he sees the abolitionist approach as a counter-movement to our movement, because he claims that the existing prevailing movement is not a rights movement. There's a lot in that. It's also not a vegan movement. Well, I think there's some argument about that, especially if you talk about the grassroots, but he would argue there isn't an animal rights movement and there isn't a vegan movement. So that's why he runs a counter-movement. So relatively equal footing comes about by the fact that rights-based animal rights is a modest idea. It's a kind of modest idea with very kind of wide-ranging ramifications, because it talks about negative rights, talks about moral rights, but it's really talking about a very kind of basic idea. Francione, for example, would say that other animals require one right in the main, or just totally across the board, which is the right not to be property. Other theorists, such as Tom Reagan, would talk a bit more expansively about the right to life and things like bodily integrity and so on, and the right to freedom, these kind of ideas. But we're talking about very kind of basic rights, and so rights theorists will often talk about basic and non-basic rights. The way I try to explain that is by thinking in terms of some basic rights are our animal rights, but we as human animals have some very basic rights, and these are the negative rights. So we don't want to be killed, we don't want to be tortured, we don't want to be oppressed. These are negative rights for which rights theory would protect us from, by saying that we're rights bearers, and saying that if those things are done to us, those things are rights violations and that they shouldn't be done to us. On top of our basic rights, we can then build our non-basic rights, which essentially are human rights. So we can build on our animal rights our human rights. If we want to talk about the right to education or the right to drive or whatever we want to do, we can talk about that, but it doesn't make any sense to talk about non-basic rights if our basic rights are not met. We cannot enjoy any non-basic right if our life is in danger. It's as kind of simple as that. So that's why relatively equal footing is important within this talk. Leslie Cross, 1951 again, and here Cross is talking that about the notion that veganism is not so much about welfare but about liberation. So putting it in that kind of activist frame, if you like. And then, hello Roger, you complaining again? Hang on. And he then says, because humanity would free itself from many of the demands made by humanity's lower nature, the benefit to humanity again would be incalculable. Again, that theme, and this interesting notion, this going back to the notion of world wars, Third Reich, this kind of like the barbarity that they had witnessed. They were product of their time. Very important to understand that the vegan social movement was born at a time of worldwide conflict, and they'd seen that something had gone wrong with humanity, and that veganism was the, if you like, the cure to it. I tend to end with this, which is a quote from a sociologist called Matthew Cole, and a chapter which is called The Greatest Cause on Earth, and basically says that the aim of veganism combines compassionate non-exploitation of other animals with an emancipated vegan self, and a more compassionate human society. Vegan ethics from the start was directed towards these interconnected goals of transforming human beings and transforming human society, with both flowing from the foundational reconfiguration of human non-human relations. Okay, so that's basically where I then turn this talk over to a Q&A, but I kind of cheat a little bit and talk about the first couple of questions, which is, they kind of come up fairly regularly, which is, didn't the pioneers, and especially Donald Watson, talk about health and diet? And that is kind of true, and we've got to realise, again, product of the time, that we're talking about the vegan society, which came out of the vegetarian society. They wanted a non-dairy section of the vegetarian society, essentially, or at least part of their magazine. They were refused by the vegetarians on the ground that that was too kind of extreme. And one of the reasons why the vegetarians thought it was extreme is that they thought that the early vegans would die. They would literally die, not something that we tend to get much anymore. And so consequently they were forced to prove that there was that vegans could actually physically survive. And so Watson did indeed talk about health and diet a lot in the very early years, because they had to establish the fact that veganism was viable as a diet. And there's another aspect to it, which is the fact that the origins of this social movement was fairly chaotic. There was a meeting in London, a few people decided, yes, we need to have a breakaway, if you like, from the vegetarian society, and we don't know the name yet, but we'll sort it all out. And then everything really, for a good while, was left up to Donald Watson. He was the chief cook and bottle washer, as we say, and things just kind of like muddled through a little bit at the beginning. Tom Reagan's notion of the muddler there. And it wasn't until several years later, when Cross in particular said, we're going to have to sort out what it means to be vegan. The definition was all over the place. The definition that most vegans quote is from 1979, or it could have been around from about 88. And that was put together by the Vegan Society. A lot of people think that that was created by Donald Watson in the 1940s. This is not true. Donald Watson wasn't great about the vegan definition himself, and so it was firmed up a few years later. And then lastly, haven't we been doing this vegan thing for ages? Is vegan education something that's been going for decades and essentially is not really proven to be that useful? This essentially is what the reducitarians are claiming, the likes of Matt Ball, for example, and this is not true. Vegan education, or vegan campaigning as we know it, is new. It's a 21st century phenomena, largely in the sense of putting veganism central in terms of our concerns, in terms of our claims. We've only just started to do it. Historically, this is brand new. And my friend Ronnie Lee, co-founder of the Animal Liberation Front, explains this very well, and I'll put an audio below where Ronnie is talking about the fact that when he went vegan, which was the early 1970s, he was saying that all the organisations were run by flesh eaters, animal consumers. And then as we moved through the 70s into the 80s, then the staff of those organisations became vegan or vegetarian. That didn't mean that they switched their campaign to veganism. When I entered the movement, we saw groups like Compassion Involved Farming, which is not a vegan oriented group, or the League Against Cruel Sports, which is not vegan oriented, as part of our animal rights movement. That's how messed up we were, essentially. Whereas the Vegan Society was that was just a food group. It was a kind of weird situation, and we certainly don't have the focus on veganism that we see now. I did many radio interviews and quite a few TV things, and I don't hardly remember talking about veganism. I mean, obviously, if people asked you would answer. But the journalist didn't ask those questions, because you would go to those events as an anti-vivisectionist or a representative of the ALF, or as an anti-blood sports person, this kind of thing, you know. And so the first question wasn't about veganism, whereas nowadays it probably would be. And certainly the first answer, regardless of what we were asked, would incorporate the notion of veganism nowadays. It's a completely different ball game. So to suggest that we've been doing this for a long time and it's failed is totally wrong. It's actually a blatant lie. You know, we have only just begun to do this. Very important to remember that. Okay, over to you, which obviously isn't going to happen in this case. So I'll end there. Thanks for watching, and comments below should you wish. Thanks very much.